Tonight, the evil crimes of Ivan Milat. 7 brutal murders. But were there more?
The horror he unleashed here, in the Belangolo State Forest on 7 young backpackers, is a stain that will never be erased from the Australian psyche.
Hi guys, thank you for clicking onto my video. My name's Emily. Now today's case is of an Australian man who abducted, raped and killed unsuspecting backpackers. He even used some of them as target practice. This is just a very disturbing case, but let's just jump into it. Ivan Milat was born on the 27th of December 1944 to mother Margaret Piddleston and father Stephen Milat, who was a Croatian immigrant. They lived in Sydney, Australia. His parents had married when Margaret was only 16 years old. However, it was known that they'd often argue. Ivan was their 5th child out of their 14 children, and he learnt from a very young age that the older siblings would bully them if you appeared to be weak, and that wasn't him, so he became quite dominant. This wasn't just learnt behaviour from his siblings, it was known that his father was a very strict man. He would harshly discipline them if they put a toe out of line. Neighbours had reported one incident where they had seen the father on the backs of his 2 sons beating the shit out of them. When Ivan was just a teenager, his younger sister Margaret had been hit by a car. He had reportedly run to the scene as it was just around the corner from their home. He had held her in his arms, covered in her blood. She had died 2 weeks later, having never woken up. The whole family was traumatised by her death, but this had hit Ivan quite hard. Most of the Milat boys were always getting into trouble with the police after that, but this had started for Ivan when he had started working at a fruit shop for Peter Cantarella. He had asked him to be a guarantor and a loan for him for a car, which Peter had gladly agreed to because Ivan was quite a good worker and he'd never given him a reason to think that he wouldn't pay him back. However, Peter hardly saw him again. Ivan wouldn't turn up to work, he wouldn't pay back the loans, which then left it to Peter as he was the guarantor. And soon after, things got worse for Peter because Ivan and his brother used to come into the shop and terrorise him and Peter's wife. They had reportedly come into his shop and took all the jewellery off of him and his wife that they were wearing. They had continued to keep going until Peter had put a stop to it and he had punched Ivan in the face, causing his eye to split open. And although he left them alone, his life of crime had just begun. As much as he wanted a career as a criminal, he sucked at it and he kept getting constantly caught. He spent most of the 60s in and out of institutions. It had also been known that Ivan had cheated with not just 1, but 2 of his brother's wives, and one of them actually falling pregnant. However, his brother Boris Milat was the one that took the role as her father.
Intimate with Ivan?
That's a part of my life I'm not really proud of, but I had been at certain points, not all the time.
You would have thought he learnt his lesson or stopped as he got older, but no, that's not him. And in 1971, he had picked up 2 hitchhikers in Liverpool. They had been on their travels and had got into Ivan's car willingly. He had taken them to a secluded spot where he'd said to both the women that he wanted to make love to them, and they were like, "Nah dude, fuck that, I'd rather pass. It's a no from me." He then threatened them with a knife and said, "You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna kill you both. You won't scream when you cut your throats, will you? Either one of you have sex with me or I'll kill you both." One of the women had pleaded to be let go, and the other woman had agreed to be raped by him instead of being killed by him. As he was raping her, he said to the other woman, "Don't watch us. Go and look out for any cars coming." After the sick fuck had finished, he drove them to a gas station and actually let them go. One of the women had asked Ivan if he had done this before, and he had said, "Yeah, I pick up hitchhikers all the time. It's the whole reason why I keep knives and ropes in my car, just in case the occasion arises." The fool had let them go thinking that they wouldn't go to the police, but that's exactly what they did, and he was caught and charged. However, he wasn't sentenced because Ivan had been acquitted by some technicality, giving him his total freedom to do it again. But with what happened and being such a close call, he knew next time he couldn't keep his victims alive. In 1975, Ivan had met his wife Karen Duck. She was only 17 years old when she met him. She was also 6 weeks pregnant with another man's baby. They too had a little girl, but obviously at a later date. But she had tried to play it safe and settle down with Ivan, only to find out that this was a huge mistake. Ivan was a very dominant person, and it was either his way or the fist way. He was known to be quite obsessed with his appearance. This extended onto his house and his garden. It all had to be in perfect order to the way he wanted it. And this transferred onto his wife. He became extremely jealous, and she wasn't allowed to go anywhere without him knowing. She wasn't allowed to spend any money, and if she did, she had to show him the receipts to prove what she had bought. Ivan was violent and very unpredictable. He'd intimidate and beat the shit out of Karen regularly, and in 1987, she'd had enough of his shit and left him. And Ivan being Ivan had to get just one last hit, and he had set fire to the front of her parents' house. She was well rid of this nutcase. It's thought that with Karen leaving and him losing his control of her, he'd gone to find it somewhere else. And on the 18th of April 1982, Caroline Clark and friend Joanne Walters had met up with each other at King's Cross. They were going fruit picking, but against their better judgment, to save on cash, they went hitchhiking. They were never seen alive again after that day. 5 months later, in September of 1982, police had been called to a scene to where a body had been found by 2 runners in the Belangolo forest. The following morning, another body had been found just 30 metres from where the first body had been found. They were the bodies of Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. It had been found that Joanne had been gagged and stabbed 14 times. Her spine had been severed and she was paralysed. She had no defensive wounds, only suggesting that she'd been paralysed before this attack started properly. Caroline, on the other hand, had been shot, and the sick fuck had not just shot her once, he had shot her 10 times in the head. And by the way that he positioned her, it looked like he used her as target practice. It had also been found that Caroline had been paralysed too. Investigators believed that from the way that the crime scene looked, the person responsible took their sweet time torturing and murdering these young women. They had also found cigarette butts and bullet casings near the bodies of these women. And even though they had been killed in such a horrific way, there was actually no signs of sexual motivation, even though one of the women's underwear was missing. They had then spent the next week searching the forest, but they found absolutely nothing. However, over a year later, in October of 1993, a local man had stumbled across some bones in the Belangolo forest. This man had always collected his firewood from this forest, but he had heard about these murders and he was quite curious about them, so each time he went back to this forest, he went to a new bit. And this day he had just so happened to stumble across some bones. He did think that they were animal bones at first, but on closer inspection, he had seen a human skull. So with that, he had no choice but to phone the authorities. These were the bones of 19-year-olds Deborah Everest and James Gibson. The pair was last seen when they went hitchhiking in 1989, and they were never seen alive again. Because they had been there so long, it was quite hard to determine how they actually died, but there was cuts on their bones and bullets surrounding them, so most likely had been shot or stabbed to death. It had also been found that there was cuts to their spines as well, so they'd most likely been paralysed too. They had also found cuts on their skulls, like he was trying to carve something into their heads. After the murders of Deborah and James, Ivan had set his sights on his next target, and on the 25th of January 1990, he had picked up 23-year-old Paul Onions. Paul had just left the Royal Navy and was looking for a fresh start. He was originally from Birmingham, but his travels had taken him to Sydney, Australia. When he first arrived, he stayed at a hostel in the King's Cross area. He was living it up, having the time of his life, going out, drinking, but soon after, the money had dried up and he needed to get a job. He tried to get some work but couldn't find anything local, but a friend had suggested to him about fruit picking. They had told him that the best place for it was in the Riverina area. Well, he didn't have to tell Paul twice, and he was on the side of the highway on the outskirts of Sydney, hitchhiking. The day had been long, and in Australia it's quite hot even for that time of the year, the lucky bastards. But Paul had gone to the shop to get himself a drink when he had been approached by a man asking which way he was heading and if he needed a lift. They were apparently going in the same direction, and this man was Ivan Milat. So Paul and Ivan had set off down the highway. While in the car, Ivan had actually introduced himself as Bill, and he asked Paul all sorts of questions, basically trying to find out whether he'd be quickly picked up on that he was missing. An hour into their journey, and Ivan's attitude completely switched from Jekyll to Hyde, and it didn't go unnoticed. Paul felt the atmosphere completely change as he watched Bill/Ivan become more agitated and aggressive, saying sexual and racist remarks and a whole load of other crap.
And then all of a sudden, I thought, oh no. First go, I've got the nutter. That was my initial reaction.
He went on, and then all of a sudden the hiding him had just shut the fuck up, and he had stopped very near to the Belangolo State Forest. Ivan said that he needed to get some cassette tapes that were underneath his seat, but Paul was quite confused because there was loads of tapes in between them. He then got out to stretch his legs, and Ivan quickly asked, "What were you doing?" And Paul cheerily asked, "What was the problem, mate?" He then got back in the car and put his seatbelt on, and so did Ivan. But then he got back out to get these tapes that he'd completely forgot the first time round. But he had pulled a gun on him. But Paul's heart had dropped out of his arsehole when he see the rope, because he knew full well if he didn't run now, he'd never be seen alive again. But that's exactly what Paul did. He got out and he legged it. He went zigzagging down the road as you're less likely to get hit, and he knew this from his army days. It got to the point that Ivan had caught up with Paul and he had tried to drag him back to the car, but Paul had got free and ran again. But this time he ran into a car of a mother of 5 and he'd got in there screaming, "He's got a gun, he's got a gun." Joanne Berry was the woman that was driving, and she hightailed it out of there.
I think he just about screamed, "Help me, he's got a gun." And that was very clear.
She had essentially saved Paul from torture and most certainly death. He had gone to the police with Joanne and reported it, but with no other leads other than Ivan's fake name, there wasn't really much they could do about it. They were all in such a rush to get away from this man that no one had actually taken his license plate down. So for the time being, Ivan Milat had gotten away with it. Paul stayed in Australia for a while, but he did return home to England. But it'd be years until Paul actually found out who Bill was. However, with Deborah and James being found, police had ramped up their search, and in November of 1993, they had found even more skeletal remains. And this was 21-year-old Simone Schmidl. She had been last seen in January of 1991. She had been on her way from Sydney to Melbourne, and she was never seen alive again. When the police had initially discovered Simone, she had been found near a fire pit with beer bowls, cigarettes and bullet casings surrounding her. She had been stabbed to death, with her too having her spine severed. It had also been found that she had been a victim of extreme torture and sexual assault. The police had come across some clothing, but none of these belonged to Simone. However, they did belong to another one of Ivan's victims. Man, if DNA was a thing back then, he would have been completely fucked there and then. But the police hadn't finished with their search, and 2 days after finding Simone, they had come across the skeletal remains of 21-year-old Gabor Nugaba and 20-year-old Anna Habshid. The clothing that was discovered with Simone belonged to Anna. It was found that Gabor was killed after being shot in the head 6 times, and Anna was decapitated with her head never being found. It appeared that Anna was alive when she was decapitated. She is believed to have been in the kneeling position when this had happened. Both Gabor and Anna had also been victims of extreme torture and sexual abuse. This animal just didn't give a fuck, did he? He didn't care what sex he was, he just got what he wanted, and he'd do what he wanted, when he wanted, and how he fucking wanted. He'd subject them to the same abuse and ultimately the same death. This was around the time where Paul Onions had heard the news of all the bodies that were turning up in the Belangolo forest, and this took him back to what Bill/Ivan had done to him. Because the police line was overloaded, his tip was actually overlooked. There were 37 detectives working on this case full time. But the one thing that had stuck out to them was a tip given to them by a man by the name of Alex Milat. He had given a statement about a year prior, and in his statement he had said that he'd seen two cars driving, the first one a sedan and the second one a four-wheel drive. He went on to say that in the first car he had seen three men, one in the front and two in the back, with a woman in between them with a cloth over her face. Then in the second car he'd seen two men, one in the front and one in the back, with a woman and a cloth over her face. It sounded like a kidnap, and although he could account for what he saw, he couldn't account for anything else. He couldn't remember no licence plate numbers. And being part of the Milat family, well, let's face it, they were all quite well known to the police. Well, at least 7 of the brothers were. So they started to look deeper into the entire family. They'd also looked at another tip that they'd got from a girlfriend of a man that worked with Ivan Milat. She had said to check into him. Investigators had found out that on the approximate days where these murders had taken place, Ivan had in fact not been at work, whereas the rest of the Milat men had been at work, giving them a clear alibi, all apart from Ivan. He also used to own a four-wheel drive, but he had sold it 2 months before the first bodies had been found. So with that, police had kept a real close eye on him. They'd also gone back and questioned Alex Milat, and this time he had revealed that Ivan had given his wife a backpack. And when he showed them the picture of this, police had instantly recognised it, because this was the backpack of Simone Schmidl. As they continued to investigate, they had actually managed to track down Ivan's old four-wheeled motor and searched it. Under the seat, they had found a bullet casing that had matched another bullet case in the Belangolo forest. While the investigations were picking up out on the road, investigators were working double time in the office, and they had finally come across the statement of Paul Onions, and all their theories about Ivan Milat had just been confirmed with this one statement. They had flown Paul out to the area of where this happened to get a better picture of actually what went down. And Paul was more than happy to help, because he was finally being listened to. What Ivan had put Paul through was the most scariest thing that he had ever been through in his entire life. I can't even begin to imagine what his victims, whom he actually successfully tortured and murdered, felt. He had also positively identified Ivan Milat in a police lineup as the man that attacked him. And with that, on the 22nd of May 1994, the police had raided Ivan's house bright and early. They had surrounded his entire house, and at the time he'd been at home with his then girlfriend. They rang him and gave him the opportunity to come out of the house, or they were going to come in and get him by any means anyway. There was a little back and forth, but Ivan eventually ended up surrendering. He was questioned, where he denied any responsibility of these murders and took it to the grave. And although he denied his involvement, the evidence the police kept finding was mounting up. In their search, they had found various guns and knives. They'd even come across items belonging to the victims. And with that, Ivan Milat was then charged for 7 counts of murder and the attempted murder on Paul Onions. They had also conducted searches at 5 of his brother's houses and his mum's house, where they had actually recovered items belonging to these victims. Ivan was then remanded in prison until his trial started on the 26th of March 1996. He stuck to his not guilty plea, stating it was up to them to prove that he was guilty and not up to him to prove his innocence. He truly believed that he was going to get away with this. He even tried passing the blame onto some of his family members, mainly his brother Richard, which is more than meets the eye about this Milat family, but I'll get to that in a little bit. But at his trial, there was 140 witnesses that took the stand. Some of them included his family members, but I do feel that this was their attempt to try and prove their innocence and back up their alibis.
I don't know. I couldn't trust inside for what? We're not going inside for anything I did.
Inside for what? Inside for murder.
Yeah, I don't I don't think so. No way, 100% positive that I should go inside for murder. For any reason. I never killed nobody. So why should I go there?
And on the 18th of June 1996, Ivan Milat had taken the stand himself and given his own evidence, but the dumbass might as well have signed his own sentence. And 18 weeks after the trial had first started, Ivan had been found guilty, and he had been given a life sentence without the possibility of parole for these 7 murders. He had also been given an additional 6 years for the false imprisonment, the robbery and the attempted murder on Paul Onions. This dickhead would never be on the highways of Australia again. But we do have a little bit of comfort, because the first day that he went into prison, he got the living shit kicked out of him. But a year later, he was back to his old tricks. It had been found that he and 2 other inmates had been planning to escape, but he'd been found out. And the next day, one of the inmates had been found hanging in their cell. Ivan was then rightfully moved to a high maximum security prison. He made many attempts to appeal, but they'd all been denied, thank fuck. He acted like a child. No, he acted like a fucking Chucky throwing his toys out of the pram, because in 2001, he had been caught swallowing razor blades, staples and any other metal objects. And on the 26th of January 2006, he had cut his little finger off in hopes to send it to the High Courts of Australia to force his appeal. He wasn't done there though, and he went on a 9-day hunger strike in May of 2011 because he wanted a PlayStation. The 4 had been denied anyway, so he ended up losing 15 kilograms for absolutely fuck all. On the 9th of August 2019, he had received a little bit of karma, as he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he had finally done the world a favour and died on the 27th of October 2019. The weeks leading up to Ivan's death, many detectives had come to visit him to see if he would actually confess to any of these murders, but the fucking stubborn prick had literally gone to the grave without saying not one word about what he'd done to any of these victims. However, there are some reports that Ivan had told his mum shortly before she died in 2001 that he was responsible for the backpack murders, which then leads me on to all the suspicious things that the Milat family had done. And this includes another murderer that's in the family that had killed in the same forest that Ivan Milat had. When the police were originally investigating this case, they had always believed that the murders had been committed by 2 people. Because let's just think about it for a second. The victims were all in pairs. Now normally, one person wouldn't be able to kill 2 people at the same time. So surely when one person was being killed, the other one would run, unless Ivan had help. Their main suspect in this was Ivan's brother Richard. However, he had denied any involvement with any of these murders. Like I said earlier, Ivan wasn't the only murderer that was in the family. His great-nephew, Matthew Milat, had gone to the exact same forest that Ivan had taken his victims to in November of 2010. He had gone there with 2 friends, Cohen Clean and David Oshaloni. It was David's 17th birthday, but it would be his last, because Matthew had attacked him with a double-ended axe while Cohen had recorded the entire attack on his phone. They had both been sentenced in 2012, Cohen to 32 years and Matthew to 43 years for David's senseless murder. The entire family, apart from Boris Milat, was just completely fucked up. They were hiding victims' stuff, taking secrets to the grave, and I feel there was more than 2 murderers in that family. This case had even been made into a couple of films, which I actually watched a couple of years ago, but if anyone's interested, they're called Wolf Creek and Wolf Creek 2. It just gives you a little bit of an insight of what the victims actually went through. But with all that being said, that's it guys. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. I mean, me personally, I feel that people like him should be given the death sentence. The fact that he got to live to the age of 74, when most of his victims didn't even live to the age of 30, is just completely outrageous. But I'm glad the old prick is dead and gone. But until next time guys, I'm gonna have to love you and leave you. Thank you for watching. Bye.